All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. So it's a little bit past 3, so we'll go ahead and get started. Happy to welcome you all to our second edition of our webinar series, The Power of Energy Management, Unleashing Potential. My name is Blake Singleton. I'm the oil and gas manager here at Peoples Company. I work out of our Tulsa, Oklahoma office, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. I'm really excited about our speakers today, who will be covering a wide variety of topics, including foundations of sustainable power, wind and solar essentials, community solar 101, and energy storage system basics for landowners. I believe you'll find this information very useful as you navigate the renewable energy industry. And I'd like to start by giving you a brief overview of Peoples Company and the services that we offer. Peoples Company, as you can see here on the map, has a national footprint with offices across the United States. We offer full service land transaction provider offering land brokerage, land management, agricultural appraisals, investment services through our capital markets team. And we also offer crop insurance and energy management. Our team has grown significantly over the years and currently consists of about 150 land professionals and staff across the country. We have offices in 10 states. As you can see, each dot on the map represents a Peoples Company office location. But today we'll be focusing on topics relevant to our energy management division. Quick overview of our energy management platform. So our team provides specialized and comprehensive management for mineral rights and renewable assets. Our team consists of experienced specialty asset managers, and through our strategic partnerships with Mineral Tech and Landgate, we consistently deliver clients the best possible service, bringing ease and peace of mind, knowing that their assets are accurately managed to maximize long-term output. As you can see here on the list of our services, include GIS mapping, lease negotiations, revenue processing. Our oil and gas clients have a 24/7 access to a client portal with real-time data pertaining to their assets. And on the renewable side, we utilize robust technology, which gives us full access to national infrastructure. And by that, I mean transmission lines, batteries, substation locations. All of this information is critical in determining the viability of a renewable project for landowners. We can evaluate renewable viability for landowners across the country with our in-house team of experts, as well as assist with lease negotiations for wind, solar, battery storage projects. Before we begin, if you have any questions, please type them in the chat section, and we'll try to answer them at the end of the webinar. Now, without further delay, let me introduce our first speaker, Kayla Rowan, who will be discussing the foundations of sustainable power, wind and solar essentials. Kayla is the director of our energy management division here at Peoples Company, located in Tulsa. She has 17 years of mineral management experience working with all types of mineral owners, including individuals, financial institutions, trusts, nonprofits, universities. She's managed properties in every area of the country. She enjoys working collaboratively with the Peoples Company team to develop and implement a second-to-none client experience by combining innovative technology, experience, and just a genuine desire to help clients achieve their goals. Kayla attended Oral Roberts University, where she graduated with a bachelor's degree in business administration and a minor in communication. Hi, Kayla. Are you ready to share your screen?
I am. Thank you for the introduction, Blake. I'm going to attempt this screen share here. Okay. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. All right. How's that?
Perfect.
Good. Okay. Well, thanks again for the introduction, and thanks to all of those who join the call. I know we've got more than a couple hundred people on the webinar with varying backgrounds. Some are landowners, some are investors, and some are just others just looking to understand the renewable space. So keeping that in mind, I will give an update of the current status of renewable energy industry, primarily focusing on wind and solar. I'm also going to discuss the power markets and interconnection challenges, and I'll spend a little time at the end explaining the different phases of a renewable project. We do have a lot to cover. Fortunately for you all, I have been told since childhood that I talk fast. So I actually feel very confident that I can get through all of it, but the real goal is to do so in a meaningful way so that each of you learn something new from this. With that, let's dive in. Okay, first let's take a look at what's driving all the activity in the wind and solar space. So the US government has committed to the world that by 2030, we will reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by more than 50% below 2005 levels. The Department of Energy also recently announced a goal of cutting the cost of solar energy by 60%, also by 2030. And then, of course, we have the 2050 goal of net zero emissions. So these are very aggressive goals. I can tell you on the first 2030 goal, it's not likely that we will hit that goal based on the information we have available. We have made meaningful progress, but it is looking more like we're going to land somewhere in the 30% range as opposed to that lofty goal of 50%. So a key to meeting these goals is through cleaner energy. That is going to require us to move more towards renewable sources like wind and solar and move away from fossil fuels. And of course, let's not forget the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, which was passed in 2022. It contains hundreds of billions of tax credits and other financial incentives for renewable energy products. And next, we'll take a look at how we're doing. Okay, this is a chart from the EIA. It shows the current trajectory that we're on. On the left, you can see that the renewables are currently trending upward while coal is declining, at least here in the United States. On the right, you can see the breakout of renewable sources. This may surprise many of you that until recently, hydro was actually the top renewable source of electricity. Wind surpassed it back in 2019, but solar only recently surpassed it just last year in 2023. I'm going to give a few stats here for those of you who are curious. You might jot these down. It's just a little bit more color on the overall breakdown of the percentages where our energy was sourced from last year. So in 2023, 60% of our electricity came from fossil fuels, 21% came from renewable energy sources, and 19% came from nuclear. Solar is the fastest growing of the renewable sources. Really, there's a few reasons for that. One is because of the policies and tax credits that we just talked about. But the other is we do have several large scale solar projects that are expected to be coming online currently and throughout the next few years. And with those in mind, the expectation is that solar power will, the generation of solar power is going to increase by 75%. We expect wind capacity to stay relatively flat with just moderate growth in the next 2 years. And then, of course, that coal line is going to continue on the same trajectory and is expected to decline another 18% in the next 2 years. Natural gas will continue to be the largest source of energy in the United States. And okay, this slide is for all of you Eclipse fans. I came across this yesterday and I just thought it was kind of fun. It is based on the solar generation drop during the eclipse in Texas. So apparently sunlight is a critical element of solar power. You can see that natural gas filled in the gap when the sun was not available to us. But I just thought the visual correlation was pretty cool to see those trend lines during the eclipse. Okay, keeping with solar, this is the list of the top 5 states of solar generation and capacity. It shouldn't surprise anyone that California is at the top, but followed by Texas, Florida, North Carolina, and Arizona. I know we have people from all across the country on the call today. So if you're surprised not to see your state on the list, maybe you've seen a lot of development in your state. Just remember that solar generation is expected to grow by 75% in the next 2 years. So as those projects come online, it is entirely possible that we'll see this list shaken up a little bit. We'll just have to wait and see what happens. Okay, next we look at wind. These are the top 5 wind states. Texas was number 2 on the solar list that we just looked at and is number 1 in wind. Also, interestingly, number 1 in oil. To be clear, I'm a proud Okie. I'm not doing any bragging for Texas, but I do want to highlight that because later on we're going to talk about some of the big reasons why they're seeing greater successes down in Texas as opposed to other markets. Okay, moving on to what some might call better states. Next on the list is Iowa, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Illinois. Again, wind is more established than solar is, and so we're not expecting to see the tremendous growth in wind in the coming years. So no drastic changes expected. Okay, next I'm going to tackle a big topic in a small amount of time. Yesterday, I told an attorney that we do a lot of work with that I was going to discuss this, and he laughed and said, I wouldn't even touch it. There's just no way you can get through that in one webinar. So challenge accepted. I say that because it is a very important topic, and I just would be remiss to not mention it, but I am not going to be able to do it total justice, but hopefully you guys will each learn a little bit about the topic, and that is the power market and the interconnection queues. So before we dive in, I'd like to start with a few key terms. FERC is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. You can see their role there on the screen. It's regulations. They regulate the interstate transmission and wholesale of the sale of electricity, natural gas, oil, hydropower products, and natural gas terminals. Next, you see ISO and RTO. For the intents and purposes of today's presentation, they serve very similar functions. An independent system operator tends to be smaller, and a regional transmission organization tends to be larger. But most power in the United States goes through either an ISO or an RTO. They are not government agencies, they are independent, and they were formed at the recommendation of FERC, just to limit government oversight, but to coordinate power generation and provide non-discriminatory transmission access to the electrical grid within their geographic area. This may look familiar to many of you. If it doesn't, this is the U.S. electric power market map. These are the ISOs and RTOs I was just talking about. Here is what you need to know. A wind turbine or a solar farm is just not very useful if there's no place for the power to go. In order to transfer the power, you've really got to get it onto the grid so that it can get to the end user. However, you can't just plug into the grid. There's a process for this, and it's called interconnection. And the interconnection process is lengthy, it's expensive. The first step is to get into what's called the interconnection queue. It is what it sounds like. It's a line, it's a long line. And so the queue has a window opening. It's not always open. Like a window, it opens and closes. It opens and closes at different times and for different time periods. And so that adds to the challenge for developers to get into the queue, not always knowing when they're going to be open far in advance. But when the window opens, a developer can submit an application showing the area where they're wanting to build the project with their specifications. If the application is accepted, then the next step is to conduct a series of studies, including facilities and feasibility studies. If the project is selected, the grid operator, which is the RTO or the ISO, then determines what equipment will be needed in order to get the project onto the grid. And they also determine the cost associated with that. The tough reality is that many projects, if they get this far in the process, they die on the vine just because of the sheer cost associated. the cost to the developer can be upwards of $50 to $100 million. And the fact is that the costs are just continuing to increase and they are unpredictable. And once the cost is determined, the developers have a short time frame in which to commit to taking on those expenses. And oftentimes that time frame is not a large enough time frame for them to raise the capital needed to cover the costs. Okay, to give you some perspective, I'm going to give you a few more stats here. So you want to write them down. Only 19% of the projects that were submitted in the interconnection queues between the year 2000 and 2018 are currently built today. And again, that's 19% success rate of getting a project that went into the queue sometime within 2000 and 2018 to actually getting it built. You can see here that some markets have better success rates than others. I alluded to this earlier with ERCOT. ERCOT's in Texas. You can see that they have a significantly higher success rate. ERCOT kind of does its own thing down in Texas. They don't have as many requirements and therefore are able to get projects online much faster. Some might argue that it's too fast. And I will say that there are a lot of people in the state of Texas, and I would venture to guess that every one of them has an opinion about ERCOT, especially after a winter storm they had a few years ago that really put their grid to the test, and they were able to identify some real challenges with the renewable mix that they have within the grid system. This map does represent data going back to the year 2000. So while it's nice to have 23 years worth of data, it is a little bit deceiving. It doesn't give a clear picture of the most recent challenges. So I want to focus on the cluster up in the Northeast, which is the New York, New England, PJM. In recent years, they've had much lower success rates. I will say between 2018 and 20, they all had less than a 10% success rate, and some were fewer than 5%. I also like to make a note that the capacity of fossil fuel burning power plants is much greater than renewable plants. The power capacity of one natural gas power plant may require up to 5 to 10 renewable projects. So again, not only do you have more projects, but you've got more projects that have to enter the queue and go through the interconnection process, which is already congested. So a few major problems are starting to emerge here, right? If you're still with me, the first problem is that there is a increasing demand for power in the United States. And the second is that we don't have the transmission infrastructure to keep up. And the third is that the current process to build out that infrastructure, which is the interconnection queue process, is not efficient. So the queues are already jammed and they're showing no signs of slowing down. And that creates a huge bottleneck. This is what a bottleneck looks like. Then this graph is a snapshot from June of 2023. It only captures windows that were open at that time, so not every market is represented here. But it shows the average duration for a project within each of these queues. So from the time it was dropped into the queue to the proposed online date, you're seeing a range here from 37 months with PJM to 70 months for the Southwest Power Pool, or SPP, that you see on the far right. 70 months, for those of you trying to do the math, is just a little over 5.5 years. So, okay. I will say FERC recently announced some major interconnection reforms back in 2023. Those reforms have not taken place in most regions. And project developers just to continue to cite grid interconnection as a leading cause of project delays and cancellations. I've seen the impacts of this even within the last week. There's just a lot of uncertainty around how the ISOs and the RTOs will implement the new changes. Many fear it will mean additional requirements in the queue process, and that makes planning increasingly difficult. So the takeaway here is that the interconnection queue process is a mess. But I am hopeful that with the FERC reforms, we will, see improvements in the long haul. But the current system is just not sustainable. And I think that we do have some more growing pains before it becomes a seamless or even a predictable process. Okay, next up, we will see how the process impacts you as a landowner by looking at the project phases. Here we have the project phases for a solar project. Wind is very similar, although the timeline may vary by a year or two. Actually, these are all estimates and could all vary by a year or two. But in concept, these are the phases of a renewable project. We start with the development period, sometimes called the option period. Once the landowner and the developer have entered into an agreement, this is best described as the due diligence period. The landowner will largely be able to continue on with the land use. So if you're farming that property, you can continue farming it during the development phase while the developer gets to work on those permits and site studies. They may come out and install a meteorological tower or do some surveying, but the disturbance will be very minimal, if any, to the property. And again, this is just when that interconnection queue is taking place. So we have 5 years on here. It's not uncommon to see 6 or 7 as developers are really trying to hedge against the uncertainty of the queues. But during this time frame, the landowner will receive annual payments. And if the project makes it to the next step and is cleared to go into construction, it typically goes pretty quickly from there. It's at this point that the current land use must be turned over to the developer. And typically additional payments are made to the landowner during the construction period. Various accommodations are made, and so there's compensation associated with that. They're often just one-time payments. And then once the project goes into operation, which is the ultimate goal of all parties, this is when the landowner really sees a significant increase in their annual payments. The money gets very real during this period, and the project is up and running and maintained by the developer. And the landowner is usually pretty happy to be receiving those checks. And the operations period, as you can see here, is the bulk of the project life cycle, is, you know, up to 30 and 40 years. And then the final phase, this takes place at the conclusion of the life of the project. The question we get asked most often by landowners is about this phase, and rightfully so. You want to make sure that your land is restored back to its original condition. And so it's really important to include language that's make sure that this is covered through a bond. So if there are any concerns or questions about the company that is owning the project, this just ensures that the funds are available at the end of the life of the project. And I just want to emphasize it is important to have somebody, whether it's an agent like People's Company, we offer these services, or just another trusted professional that you have in your circle to walk you through this process and make sure that your interests are protected. Okay, we covered a lot here, and we talked about the renewable energy outlook and the anticipated growth, especially in solar. I hope that you all have a basic understanding of power markets and the interconnection challenges, as well as the phases of a solar project. Thank you for those who hung with me. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. And if you fell asleep, now is time to wake up, because you have 2 really great speakers coming up. Thank you. Blake, you're muted if you're talking.
Yep, sorry about that. So thank you, Kayla, for presenting that. That was awesome information. I've seen firsthand how your knowledge and experience has really helped landowners efficiently work through the negotiations for this type of asset. So thank you again. If you have any questions for Kayla, like she said, you can go ahead and put them in the chat, and she can try and answer them there. But next up, we have Mike Greczyn talking on Community Solar 101. Mike's been a project developer for wind, solar, and battery storage projects for the last 16 years. During that time, he's seen about 800 megawatts worth of wind and solar projects go from the development to operating power plants in Colorado and Maryland. And as is the case with anyone who has operated in this industry for any amount of time, there's also a lot of projects that have not been completed or to the construction phase yet. Mike started his career in energy, working for a major international wind developer, and transitioned with the industry to work on first solar and then battery projects. These days, Mike is focused on early stage development, which primarily means site identification, early feasibility, screening, and land acquisition. He works with two small but mighty companies in the space, Farm First Energy, where they are laser focused on making sure landowners' interests are served if and when they decide to lease their property to a renewable energy developer. And then also Altus Energy Services, which is a contract development service company serving mainly independent power producers. Welcome, Mike. Great to see you. You ready to share your screen?
I am. Thank you very much, Blake. Let me just get going here. Okay, let me know if you're seeing my presentation or my notes.
We are good to go. We can see your presentation.
Sounds good. So Blake, thank you for that really kind introduction. Again, my name is Mike Greczyn, and here I'll be presenting on behalf of Farm First Energy. Farm First is a developer of renewable energy projects that puts the farm interests first. So the landowners come first here. I have been a wind and solar project developer since 2008, and I focus on early stage development, which is everything up to and including interconnection. I'm active in the wind, solar, and battery storage markets, and I've seen multiple 100 megawatt wind projects and community solar projects come to market during my time. So here's a quick overview of what we're talking about, a little bit about Farm First Energy. We'll dig into some community solar 101, talk about how community solar can benefit the small parcel landowner, and then look at some numbers from an Illinois community solar portfolio that Farm First Energy brought to market. So power to the landowner. Renewable energy development has changed since I started working in this industry. More and more large, reputable wind, solar, and storage players like NextEra, Enel, Duke, Leeward, etc., are looking to secure earlier stage projects in order to control the development process. In other words, not buying or inheriting marginal or what we call crappy projects from other developers who could not get them done. So this allows these larger players to capture more of the value. And here at Farm First, we help landowners understand project economics and run a process to connect them with the best developer partner for their particular case. Our role is to help landowners get the best buildable deal. In doing so, we practice largely the art of the possible. The best buildable deal is not always the highest paying deal on paper or the ideal project size and location for the developer. There's an inherent conflict between the developer and the landowner when it comes to contract terms and facility locations. And in these conflicts and these discussions, we advocate for the landowners. We put the farm first. So there's a little bit of a difference between small projects and large projects. Large projects often need multiple, if not dozens, of landowners. And in those larger projects, we tend to pursue an anchor landowner development model where we partner with a large local landowner who then acts as a local advocate for the project to help get neighboring landowners on board to meet our project size, and also generally just being on the ground project advocate. So that helps us when it comes to project permitting and elevating the project in the eyes of the local community. Helps to have local folks on your side of the table when it comes down to things like getting right of way or getting your permits. Smaller projects, and here we mean community solar, which we'll be talking more about later, and battery energy storage systems can usually be on one landowner, but sometimes you need a right-of-way partner to get to the point of interconnection or the substation. So here are our key players in our company. So Brad Haight has been working in the space as a developer or an attorney, or sometimes both, since 2000. He likes to call himself the Jimmy Stewart of renewable energy, and has been involved with thousands of megawatts of development and operating projects across the country, from project inception through repower. And repower is might be a new term, but it's just another phase of project development where at the end of project life, instead of decommissioning, you might seek to add better equipment to the project to extend its life. Brad brings a deep knowledge of current market lease terms and novel ways to extract more value for landowners. Brent is Brad's partner, and he has developed, built, and financed over 4 gigawatts of wind and solar projects as an investment banker and an executive at Tri Global Energy and Sunshare. Sorry, I realize I've overrun my slides here. Just catching up. So this is a quick case study on a project that that Farm First Energy executed and closed on in 2021. They co-developed this with 2 farmer ranchers in Texas, and they had 3,000 out of 3,000 available acres on those properties. 1,500 acres were planned for solar. When Farm First stepped in, development had stalled. They had an existing interconnection queue position. The project surrounds some existing feedlots supporting 15,000 head and 5,000 head of cattle, respectively. And they had to put in build corridors for ongoing access for those ranchers so they could continue operating ranches with the solar projects being installed, and allow access to nearby water wells. So Farm First covered partners' legal expenses and drafted short info memos and marketed the sites to a short list of renewable energy developers who had SPP in West Texas interest and potential offtake. So that brings that partnering with the landowner and to identify and build relationships with the most appropriate project developer in the end. And this project closed in Q3 of 2021. So community solar. What is community solar? Community solar is a different model of solar development. It involves small projects that connect directly to local distribution grids rather than large-scale bulk transmission systems. And it allows the solar project operator to sell electricity at retail prices directly to the end user. What this results in is higher margin projects for developers, which translates into better economics for landowners. Lower voltage at the interconnection level means shorter interconnection timeframes, which is important, as Kayla mentioned earlier, and often lower interconnection costs. Smaller projects sometimes, not always, mean easier paths to permitting, and the lower project capacity, or putting projects on these smaller distribution lines entails a more efficient use of utility infrastructure that's already in place. They do have some negative aspects to them. They're only available in certain markets, so not all states have community solar programs available. You can see that you have some legislation that's required to be put into place first. And then local utilities have to develop their programs that will support these. So they're not available in all states. Where they are available, smaller projects are also more sensitive to upfront costs. So if you get unpleasant surprises on your interconnection studies, those can pose a higher risk to project completion. They're still very location dependent. You have to be in an appropriate utility territory. You have to have 3-phase power on your on your property, and you have to generally be within about 5 miles of a substation. And finally, utilities tend not to like this model as much because they don't get to benefit quite as much as they do from utility scale projects. So as I mentioned, not everywhere in the United States has a utility or has a community solar program available. This is an outdated map from 2019. However, the map really hasn't changed much since then. We are still looking for programs to come online in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and we have some potential markets that we're looking at. Hopefully, Iowa will be opening up soon. The important things to note, though, are the overall growth of the market. Over 5.8 gigawatts of community solar have been installed through second quarter of last year. And that's as compared to 179 gigawatts of total solar capacity installed in the United States. The next 5 years should see that figure more than double. 5 years from now, we're projected to have a 14 gigawatt community solar market nationwide. Community solar and the small parcel landowners. How can small landowners benefit from this model? Well, they can host a community solar garden or a community solar project, as they call them. Typically, these are about 25 or more acres. You can often get 5 acres, get a megawatt onto 5 acres. Although that number may be smaller now. 5 acres per megawatt was a very good number about 3 or 4 years ago. As technology has advanced, solar panels have gotten more powerful, and you can now maybe get a megawatt on less than 5 acres. The first step is the landowner would enter into a long-term lease with a solar project developer. These are at least 20 years and often last up to 50 years. And as Kayla covered earlier, they involve a development, a construction, an operating, and then finally a decommissioning term. Some factors that make up the ideal community solar parcel, as discussed earlier, on or near a low voltage substation. That's going to be, you want to be within 5 miles of those generally. On or very near low voltage distribution lines. So that'd be 3-phase power, usually in the 12.5 to 34.5 kilovolt range. You want a flat land. A slight south-facing slope is great if you can get it. Sunny. Very few wetlands, brush, or timber. Located on good roads. Access to public right-of-way is key. And then limited setbacks. And here at Farm First, the way we approach these projects is we try to work with landowners to identify their lowest value property and make sure that that is what's used first in any solar project that gets developed. Generally speaking, you can locate one of these anywhere on your property. Any 25 to 50 acre piece of a farm can be used, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the land that the developer wants. It can be, the back 40 that maybe is less productive. As long as you have access to the utility lines that you're going to connect to, the developer should be able to use almost any land that is on your parcel. So here's a quick example of an 80-acre parcel in Illinois. This site, we indicated a 5 megawatt project for, so that blue area that you see on that map is roughly 25 acres. There's a project substation located adjacent to this property. Although you can't see it, there's a railroad that runs between the property and the substation. However, the power line crosses the railroad, so you can connect essentially right next to the property. No wetlands on this piece of land, and the total parcel area is about 80 acres. And you can see that we only need a small portion of this. if that 25-acre portion that's outlined here is not the area that the farmer wants to use, for example, maybe the farmer just put in drain tile at very high expense. You know, we could work with the landowner to move that 25 acres north and maintain access to that point of interconnection in the south without really affecting project economics. So what we would do at Farm First is sort of advocate that we need to take that solar area and put it where it works best for the farmer, not necessarily best for the developer. So the benefit to the landowner of the community solar model is that you can receive very attractive rent checks. While the solar garden is being developed, the farmer will continue to farm the land. Does not need to be taken out of farming until ground is broken. So they get to still earn their farm income during development. In long term, once that project is in place, the operating lease rate should materially exceed the expected farm income. And we can get into some specifics here in a second. But finally, the farmer gets to diversify their land revenue with a stable, escalating long-term income stream that's independent from the price of farm commodities or the expense of the inputs. Here's some indicative numbers for a community solar project. These numbers are a bit stale. So I would say that these rent numbers were probably good 2 or 3 years ago. Now you would probably see rent closer to about $1,500 per acre versus $1,000. You know, maybe more than $1,500 depending on where you were at. Development and construction rent are going to be lower than that, but often for the development time frame, you would expect to get about $100 an acre or more. And then construction rent isn't always paid because construction time frames are very fast. It takes a matter of 3, 4, maybe 6 months at the outside to build a community solar project. So often you just roll right into operating rent. But if development rent or construction rent is paid, it's typically about half of operating rent. So here's an example of a portfolio that Farm First brought to market in Illinois. And so the Illinois State Legislature passed the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act back in 2021 and mandated a certain percentage of renewables by 2030, so specifically 40% and 50% by 2040 versus only 9% when the law was passed. So that implies some very rapid growth. And in the community solar market particularly, they were looking at an additional 1,500 megawatt or 150 megawatts, of solar, community solar every year. That works out to about 30 community solar projects at 5 megawatts. So that's quite a few projects getting put in, and that needs to happen every year between 2021 and 2030 for Illinois to hit their goals. They put in attractive renewable energy credit programs to encourage that growth. And Illinois customers can join this at no cost and typically receive about 20% discount on their customers' electric bill. So there's an advantage to customers as well here. And these programs have proven very popular with utility consumers. So we started by partnering with some highly respected land manager and identified portfolios of small land parcels in the 50 to 250 acre range. The land manager had discretion to negotiate lease forms and transaction terms. Moved on to review the portfolio, so we provide GIS mapping of all projects, screening for those critical elements of proximity to substations, 3-phase power lines, flat land, roads, etc., avoiding wetlands and floodplain. I narrowed it down to about 23 ideal sites, and at the end of the day, I think 3 to 5 of those went to final completion. And you can see moving through the phases of preparing materials and marketing and closing these projects. So it's a fairly involved process. And again, Farm First views our role as advocating for the landowner's interest at every step of the way. And here's an example of how we align our interests with the landowner's interests throughout the process. So we get paid a developer fee when we sell these projects to the ultimate developer, and we share that with the landowners. Typically, we split that 50-50. And there's also success fees upon project construction start and completion. And we also split those with the landowners. And as you can see here, these are illustrative numbers, but this is how it would work out for a 23 project portfolio with an average project size of 5 megawatts, 575 acres total in the portfolio, 115 megawatts equivalent, and 6 actual projects. So this is actually a fairly, it may seem like a low success rate, but for the industry, this is actually a fairly good success rate. Six projects out of 23. A lot of obstacles to getting a project from development all the way through to construction and operations. And that would conclude my portion of the presentation. And thank you very much for your attention if you're still with me. Now I'll pass it back to Peoples.
All right. Thank you, Mike. You clearly have an in-depth understanding of community solar, and we appreciate your insights to that arm of the industry. Next up, we've got Robert Wilson. Robert is the development manager for Qcells North America. Qcells is a top domestic manufacturer, EPC contractor, and developer of renewable energy projects in the United States. Prior to Qcells, Robert served as the senior land acquisition manager for AES Clean Power and S-Power, leading the siting efforts of wind, solar, and energy storage projects across the country. Robert received a Master's of Science from the University of Colorado Denver's Global Energy Management Program. Robert, welcome. You ready to share?
Let's do it.
All right.
All right, can you see my screen there?
Yes.
So I'll talk about energy storage projects today. Qcells is a domestic manufacturer of solar modules. We're the highest distributor of modules for residential and commercial use in the United States. I'm on the utility scale side, so developing and building projects for use by utilities for power generation. Not only do we manufacture modules, but we have partnerships in components such as FlexRack on their software systems, as well as LG for battery components, all the way from manufacturing in our factories in Georgia to reuse and recycling at their end of useful life. So we're really a full circle provider of renewable energy. So an energy storage system, I can go into kind of the financials of it as well as what they're utilized for. Essentially, it's a big battery, easily described as the size of a shipping container. That glorified, they look a little nicer these days. They can either be individual compact containers or shipping containers as shown, or they can even be utilized in warehouses or buildings in a building solution. That can be nice because we can also stack them. So if you're short on space, you can stack the project to achieve more megawatts of storage capacity although that does increase on your total CapEx costs. This is essentially what they look like on the inside. It's battery racks, controls, and then there's always a fire suppression system. It's really lithium ion cells stacked into modules and then onto racks in each one of these lithium ion battery components. Fire is a big concern. There have been some issues in the past with fires on sites. So all of our projects are NFPA compliant. You can see a list of regulations that we have to abide by. A more important component when we're developing projects is that we always work with the local fire department to address fire concerns. And if there was an incident, the most appropriate way to resolve it. Trying to put it out with water, it can actually make it worse. And so it's better to rely on the fire mitigation system that's inside the battery. The benefit of energy storage projects to communities and to landowners, obviously for the landowner, it's the opportunity to sell their property if it's a purchase option, or for a lease, then it would be a long-term lease revenue. There's a much greater property tax revenue that goes to the community if it's on an agriculture parcel. Typically these projects are zoned light or general industrial, and so the tax revenue that goes to the municipality is about 10 times greater than if it were an agriculture parcel. Obviously there are jobs that are created during construction, although during the life of the project, there might be 4 to 8 full-time jobs just to maintain the facility. Most importantly, I think the energy storage facilities provide grid stabilization. It's similar to what a peaker plant does. It's there to provide grid reliability and prevent any potential brownouts. A big and complicated question that we always get is how these projects generate revenue. And there's essentially 3 different mechanisms that can often work in tandem. The first is energy arbitrage, which is, to say it simply, buy low, sell high. A good example, as Kayla mentioned earlier, was Winter Storm Uri in Texas. In that instance, there was a huge deficit of power being delivered to ratepayers. And so when you look at supply and demand economics, the cost of power went through the roof because there was low generation on the system. And so in that instance, if you were using energy arbitrage with a merchant battery energy storage system, you would have bought the power at a very, very low rate and been able to sell the power at the peak in that instance for about a 225% or multiple. So that's energy arbitrage, buy low, sell high. Ancillary services is very appealing, and resource adequacy are both very appealing to utilities or transmission service providers, TSPs. Essentially, the project is paid to store power as a contingency reserve, so that you can deliver that power back to the grid if there's an event of an unexpected failure or an outage. Similar to Black Start regulation, we're kind of on standby providing ancillary services to the transmission provider. And then a big component is the short-term imbalances. So it's kind of adding a cushion to the transmission system. If there's an event of over generation or under generation, we can kind of fill that gap. Resource adequacy is the final revenue generating mechanism. It's when utilities will pay us to basically stand by to provide the power for their consumers. And it's essentially the capacity pricing mechanism is where we're generating revenue. Most importantly, what you need to think about with battery storage projects is that we're there to store the abundance of energy that's generated throughout the day. So if you look in a place like California, there are often times when there's so much solar generation that power is actually priced at a negative. So we could store that power when it's really low as price per kilowatt hour, and then deploy it later in the day when everyone gets home from work. There's less solar generation and all the appliances are going on. That speaks to what we call in the industry the duck curve. So that's when generation goes up really high and then starts to taper off towards the end of the day. Sequentially at the same time is when the demand peaks. It's home and all the appliances are turning on. So battery storage projects fill the gap towards the end of the day when there's the deficit of supply and demand. We can provide energy that's been stored throughout the day and then deliver at a peak time. Common landowner concerns often for property taxes, we typically use a purchase option or a lease option. During the option payment, landowners can continue utilizing their property any way they see fit, as long as it doesn't change the status greatly for our project. The property taxes won't change during the option period. If it's a lease option, any change in property taxes we will assume. So if it's to be taxed as a light industrial parcel, we would assume any increase in property taxes. When it comes to zoning, if you're in a place like metropolitan Phoenix, it's a lot easier to site these projects in an area that's already zoned light industrial or commercial, because it's typically designated as a light industrial use or defined that way. It can be a little bit more difficult when it's in like an agriculture area, because those parcels are typically greater. So not only do we have to subdivide and replat the parcel, but we also have to go through a conditional use permit process to redesignate our project as light industrial on that parcel rather than agriculture or rural. Probably the biggest concern when landowners are talking about lease agreements is the decommissioning. It's industry standard for our agreements to have a decommissioning and remediation plan in place. And to kind of back that up, municipalities almost always require a bond to be set when they issue a conditional use permit. That bond is typically set designating the municipality as the beneficiary. So in the event 20 years from now, 40 years from now, the project's no longer operational, but nobody can track down who the operator is. Worst case scenario, hopefully never happens, but there's money that's set aside, usually refreshed every 5 years, so it stays relevant. That money can be utilized to decommission the project. Next, I'll go through some examples of what these have looked like. This is one of our projects in Texas. You can see here it's a 27-acre parcel. It's a purchase option. We would take ownership of the parcel, and then we would have to subdivide it to basically deed over a portion of the project to the transmission service provider in the form of the switching station. So that's an example of a replatting. Here's some renderings that we did for a project that we just finished in Hunt County, Texas. This is an energy storage project. As you can see, some of the renderings that were done for the permitting process. This is under construction. It's pretty similar to the rendering, so I think we did a good job. And then finally, this is the completed Cunningham storage project, operating and delivering grid resiliency to Hunt County, Texas. And with that, at time, appreciate everyone's time for tuning in. I hope I was able to share some knowledge nuggets. Feel free to throw some questions our way.
All right. Thank you very much, Robert. I had the honor of hearing you present a few times, so it's always a treat. And it's you just have such a unique set of experiences, and appreciate you taking the time today to join us. I know we are running a little behind on time, but I do want to get some questions in. So if you do have to hop off, not a problem. This is all recorded and will be available on the People's Company website here in the next couple of days. But we'll go ahead and dive in. Kayla, I've got a question for you. You talked about the increased demand or demand increasing for renewables. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Oh, yeah, good question. Actually, I had some slides with a bunch of stats that I removed at the last minute. But yeah, so demand has really increased here in the United States. I would say the biggest factor in that is technology, specifically AI. The warehouses and infrastructure that are required to keep up with that AI is so much higher than the traditional cloud storage that we're used to seeing. And so it just makes Robert's presentation all that much more relevant. Is battery storage is obviously a huge component to that as well. So, you know, I think people often think population growth whenever we see increases in demand. Our population growth has been relatively small. Now people are redistributing throughout the country, moving out of cities into more rural areas. So if there's not an existing infrastructure in place, you know, there's got to be some transmission available. But I would say biggest contributor is tech, Google, Amazon, Facebook. Those are the biggest drivers.
Great. Thank you very much. Mike, this next question is for you. What is your opinion on agrivoltaics and cover crops?
That is a good question, Blake, and it does come up when folks talk to us about land use. And I think on agrivoltaics, that's a we're kind of at the beginning of seeing what agrivoltaics can do. We've only seen a few of those projects move forward, and generally speaking, they're done by research or academic institutions as pilot projects. There are two sort of main types of agrivoltaics right now: sheep grazing or goat grazing, and then vegetable farming. Sheep grazing and goat grazing can work because those animals or that type of livestock is less destructive to solar panels and wiring than cattle. And we have seen some benefits to the industry from that type of use. They can help keep the vegetation under control. If you don't graze, you have to mow, and that's an expense that the project has to bear. And then there's also been some benefits to vegetable farming, but large scale crops in and around solar farms, I think, is something that needs a little bit of work before we introduce it to the market.
Sure.
And then cover crops, absolutely, you should always do cover crops. During construction, it's used as a sort of dust and stormwater control measure.
Great. Thank you very much. Robert, I've got another one for you, or one for you. So this one says, as a landowner, what should I be mindful of if I'm approached about putting a battery storage system on my property?
If I was a landowner, obviously you'd want to make sure that the energy storage system is located adjacent to a substation or a transmission line that's crossing your property. If it's any further than it has to be, you'd have to incorporate some sort of transmission easement so that you can connect the two. Also, depending on the size, I would say assume that you would have to sacrifice about 20 acres for your typical energy storage project, and that's accounting for the need for the switchyard as well as any sort of retention basins for runoff, and then also setbacks that the county might require. If you're really wanting to twist the arm of the developer, you could also request some sort of view shed buffer if one isn't required, or vegetative buffers if one isn't required by the municipality.
Okay, awesome. Thank you very much. Kayla, it looks like you maybe had a couple questions in the chat.
That I have a couple of questions. I've looked at a few. There's one I was trying to answer that
Okay.
I was struggling to get answered. So about People's Company typically being compensated.
Mhm.
Our structures vary depending on the services that were offered. They typically are through a consultation type structure, and depending on the work that needs to be done, we it will vary. Whether we do valuations and appraisals, that looks a little different than if we're offering negotiation for a lease. And so it will depend, but you're welcome to, I'm not trying to be too obtuse here or obscure, but I just don't have a direct answer for that question without more detail. And I saw one that was asking during Brad's presentation about the colors. If Barry, if you're still on, if you could give a little bit more insight as to which slide that was, I'm sure Mike would be happy to answer it. And then, yeah,
Okay.
those are the answers I have.
And as I mentioned, because I want to be mindful of everyone's time, if you have any questions, after the webinar, please send them to our energymanagement@peoplescompany.com email. We'd be glad to get those answered for you in a timely manner. And with that, I will go ahead and call it. We really appreciate everyone joining us today. Just want to thank all of our speakers for their time. And as I mentioned, this presentation of the webinar will be on the People's Company website here in the next couple of days. So feel free to view it again and kind of, if anything comes up from watching it, like I said, feel free to reach out to any of us. And with that, I will go ahead and conclude the webinar. So thank you all very much. Appreciate your time, and I hope you all have a great rest of your week.